Hi everyone, thanks for joining me. If you like chat about the Beatles, McCartney, Lennon and other classic rock artists, then please subscribe to my channel and you will be notified of my future videos. Thank you very much. Today we are looking at the Beatles' Rubber Soul album.
Plastic Soul, man, Plastic Soul.
So Rubber Soul was released on the 3rd of December 1965. By that time that year, the Beatles had already made an album, they'd made a film, they'd been on a full world tour. They decided that they needed to get an album out in time for the Christmas market. So they made this album and then went out on an 18-date UK tour just to finish the year off. Absolutely crazy to think that any band could fit that much into 1 year, after they'd pretty much done similar the year before as well. So Rubber Soul, they wrote most of the album after they'd finished the US tour in the summer of 1965. And it's quite a progression from what they'd done before. You can see that it's influenced by Bob Dylan and probably the Byrds as well. It's got that kind of folky feel to it, especially the US version of the album. Now I'm mainly going to talk about the UK version, but I am going to talk about the differences between the two different versions that got put out. So they came into the studios in October to start recording this album, and they'd got most of the songs ready, but certainly not all of them by that point. And in fact, at one point during October, they actually cancelled the studio sessions that they had booked because they'd run out of material. They had to go and write some more so that they could come back and continue making the album. They were recording things like 12 Bar Original, which you'll know from Anthology 2, and it was not great. It was trying to be sort of like an authentic blues kind of Booker T and the MGs kind of thing, but actually it was pretty average, and it's no surprise that it got left on the shelf for over 30 years until the anthologies came out. It certainly wouldn't have been up to the standards that's on the Rubber Soul album. Also during the sessions for this album, they recorded Day Tripper and We Can Work It Out, which were then taken away and issued, of course, as a double A-side single. So, I mean, imagine what Rubber Soul would have been like with those two songs on it as well. Incredible that they could just take those out and leave them off. That just shows the quality of the material that they had to hand at the time. In a moment, I'm going to go through each song on the album and give my thoughts on it. But I just wanted to just show you the versions of the album that I've got. So up here, you'll see that's the 1987 CD. I've got all my Beatles 1987 CDs up in that top corner there. And Rubber Soul, that was my first version of the album that I ever had and the one that I got to know. I've also got the vinyl version from the Beatles mono box set. Absolutely stunning version. That is by far my favourite version of the album. Over here, I've got the version from the Beatles 2009 stereo remasters. That's the CD version from that. I've got the mono CD from the mono CD box set. And up here is that American version, which I've got as part of the Capitol Albums box set. But that's the version that, of course, those of you in America who were around at the time probably got to know that particular version of the album. And that's the version that Brian Wilson got to know. So this album was a massive influence on Brian. He then said that he wrote Pet Sounds pretty much off the back of wanting to do something as good as Rubber Soul, because this album had blown him away. And it's almost certainly, I would imagine, the American version of the album that he's talking about. The American version of the album's, it's really interesting how different it is to the UK version, which is the version that the Beatles put together. And then, of course, Capitol Records made this version themselves. So Drive My Car is not there. That doesn't open the album. And instead, we've got I've Just Seen a Face, which people in Britain would have known from the Help album previously, earlier on in the year. That album also includes It's Only Love, again, originally from the UK version of the Help album. But it doesn't have What Goes On, the song that Ringo sang, and it also doesn't have Nowhere Man or If I Needed Someone. Nowhere Man to me is a particularly interesting omission, just because I think it would have fitted, even though in America they were trying to go for a folkier version of the album, and I thought Nowhere Man would have fitted that, but no, that was kept off, and some of those songs were issued the following year on the Yesterday and Today album instead. So it always intrigues me how people in America and people in Britain got to know such different versions of the albums. And even to this day, people are still obviously very fond of the version of the album that they grew up with. So let's have a look through the songs on the album. Like I said, I'm going to go through the UK version here. So it starts with Drive My Car, which I think is a great opening to the album. It's a real good Paul rocker telling the story of a girl who just wants to be famous, a star of the screen, but you know, for now you can drive my car. And it's got that classic beep beep yeah, which I think that's one of those things that even if you don't know the Beatles song, it's been used in so many things in TV over the years that just that particular phrase is really sort of well known in its own right. Next up, it's Norwegian Wood, which I would say is in my top 10 songs of all time by anybody. Notable, of course, because it was the first use in a Western pop rock song of the Indian sitar instrument. Now, I believe that to be the case. If I'm not right with that, please let me know, but that's always been my understanding. And I think it's really interesting to look back a few months to the Help film, and there's a scene in an Indian restaurant where the Beatles are, and there's Indian music playing in the background, and it'd be lovely to think that, you know, that would have been something that would have inspired George to start thinking about that type of music, because of course he went on to have a love of it for the rest of his life. I actually looked up a couple of years ago what particular albums was it of Ravi Shankar that he was interested in that got him into it, because he'd always said how Ravi was the main influence for him. And I tracked it down to this, an album called Portrait of Genius, which I've now got the CD of, obviously, and this was recorded in 1964. So this was a new album at the time, and I would really recommend this if you're interested to sort of think about what inspired George Harrison to get into Indian music. Have a look at Portrait of Genius by Ravi Shankar from 1964, because that is the album that George said was his main influence starting out on that path. So the song itself, it's a great song, of course, by John, and just a great story about going back to a girl's house and her showing him her room, and she goes to have a bath and she lights a fire, and it just tells a really great story. Possibly a true story. Could it be John talking about an affair that he once had? Possibly speaking. But it's just a beautiful song and absolutely one of my favourites. Next up, You Won't See Me. So another Paul song, and this runs at about 3.5 minutes, which for Beatles songs at that period of time was almost unheard. So it feels like, even the 3.5 minutes isn't long for a song, it feels like a long song if you've been listening to Beatles songs sort of up to that point. But a real good pop song by Paul. He was starting to really sort of come into his own as a writer by this point. I think he'd been overshadowed by John in the early days. John was very much the leader and was probably sort of bringing out the biggest and best songs earlier on. Paul's starting to catch him up in places round about this time. You Won't See Me was a great example by Paul of one of his kind of signature songs. Next up, Nowhere Man. Great song by John. I think this is a great example of a song where Paul and John were trying to push each other to new highs, and I think this is absolutely a song that was, you know, John trying to show how great he could be, and fantastic harmonies in this song. It's one that I absolutely love. Of course, it was used to great effect a few years later in the Yellow Submarine film, but just a classic Beatles song, like a mid-era Beatles song. It's one of the best for me. Next up is George's first song on the album, Think for Yourself. So George had very few songs on Beatles albums up to this point. The number differs depending on which versions of the albums you're familiar with, but it's still a really small number. And it's got that great fuzz bass on this song and great harmonies too. I think this is George growing as a songwriter by this point. It had varying success up to this point, but this was definitely the most progressive song that he'd written so far up to this point. Real good song by George. Think for Yourself. Excellent. Next up, it's The Word. And this is, I think this is sort of the start of the Beatles going into that whole era of sort of Summer of Love and the things that came over the next couple of years. This was the first song that was specifically about love, not loving a particular person like She Loves You, Love Me Do, etc., but just love in general. So they went on to do this sort of several times, obviously with things like All You Need Is Love being a prime example. But this was, I think this was the start of that. I think it's very heavily influenced by the time that they've been spending in America. But again, great harmonies between John and Paul on that song. And just another great song. Next up is Michelle, one of Paul's sort of classic early ballads. And I mean, Paul tells the story all the time about how this song came about. It had this sort of little French thing, as he called it, that he used to do at parties to try and impress the girls. And eventually one day John said, hey, you know that thing that you do? Could we make it into a song? And that's what Paul did. So it's something that they'd had hanging around for quite a long time before it been needed for this album. But a classic early Paul song. Fantastic. Next up on the UK version of the album anyway, it's Ringo's contribution, What Goes On. And it's actually his first songwriting credit on an album, so that's credited to Lennon, McCartney and Starkey. So this is, I think it's very much like a follow-on to Act Naturally that they'd done earlier on in the year on the Help album. This is more sort of their own writing of that song really, but in a sort of a progressive Beatles kind of way. So good harmonies again between John, Paul and Ringo on this song. And, you know, it's not going to be the best song on the album, I don't think, but it's a good addition. And I don't know, how do people in America feel about that not being on the American version of Rubber Soul? Is that something that you're happy about? Do you wish it had been on there? Let me know about that. I'd love to hear your comments on that. Next up, it's another John song, Girl. So another great example of the sort of folky kind of songs that they were doing in this period. And it's got that great backing vocal, the that goes through, and John's sort of heavy breathing, sort of girl. And he's really close up on the microphone, and you get a real good sort of feeling as though John's in the room with you when you're listening to it. But another example of the sort of confidence that they had at that time to be able to do that kind of thing on record. Another fantastic song. Then we've got I'm Looking Through You, which was Paul's song that he wrote about Jane Asher, who was his girlfriend at the time. He was living with her in her house with her parents. And it's another great early Paul acoustic song. And I think what's interesting for me is when I got to know the American version of the album up there, there's the stereo and the mono version. Now on the stereo version, it's really interesting because there's two false starts of that when Capitol Records got the tapes, I just don't think they either, I don't know whether they couldn't be bothered or whether they just didn't edit the tapes that they had, but you've got two false starts on there that are left on the final version of the record, which is it takes you back when you hear the album for the first time, that version of it. It really sort of messes with your mind a bit. But another great early acoustic song by Paul that was really showing how he was blossoming as a songwriter. Next up is another absolutely classic song. It's In My Life by John. So just a great introspective song talking about, you know, there are places I remember all my life. I actually was up in Scotland recently, and I was up at a John Lennon memorial right up on the north coast of Scotland in a place called Durness, which is a place he used to visit as a child regularly. He went on holiday to Scotland every year as a child. And this was one of the places that he was talking about allegedly in this song, where he's saying there are places I'll remember all my life. So that was really great to go and actually see one of those places, but it not be one of the places you might naturally think of, like one of his areas of Liverpool that he grew up. And I love how this song was chosen to open up the Beatles anthology film in 1995 on that first episode, where they do that little intro of just little scenes from the Beatles, and then they talk about we're going back, and you see the camera pan down onto the Mersey, and In My Life plays, and they do this beautiful montage of people who meant something to the Beatles story, whether it's Brian Epstein or George Martin or the Beatles themselves. And it's just fantastic song for evoking those kind of memories, and absolute classic. You've got the George Martin part actually in the middle of the song, where he plays keyboard, and I believe what they did was in the studio, didn't they play the song at half speed, and he he recorded it sort of at half speed, and then when the song's played at the normal speed, they've obviously got to double the speed of that, and it sounds like it's something completely different by that point. But it was a great George Martin addition to the song as well anyway, and absolute classic, love it. Next up, it's Wait. Now this is a unique song on the album because it wasn't recorded for the Rubber Soul album. It was recorded months earlier for Help, but wasn't used there. Now, the other thing that to me that's interesting about this is that Paul has described Wait as being completely his song. John Lennon seemed to back that up when he was interviewed, I think in 1970. He said that that must be one of Paul's songs as well. And yet when you listen to the verse, the predominant voice is John's, whereas normally you'd expect a John song to have John's voice as the main voice, a Paul song to have Paul's voice. But this seems to be a Paul song where the predominant voice in the verse anyway is John's. So it's interesting to think what the Beatles might have thought of this song, because they initially rejected it for the Help album and they brought it back when they needed something else to finish this album off. So I don't know whether it's their highest regarded song, and it's not the greatest song on the album, but still a good addition to the Beatles catalogue, and one that I'm very glad that we've got. So yeah, it's a good song. Next up, on the UK version of the album anyway, not the US version, is George's second song on the album, If I Needed Someone. I adore this song. I love the guitar intro that's on it. I think it's, again, him showing that he's growing as a songwriter. And this is one that they performed on the 1966 tour. So the Beatles obviously thought enough about it to fit it into their very short shows that they were still doing even by the end of the touring period. Wonderful song. Again, it's great harmonies all the way throughout. Love it. Last song on the album, it's John's Run For Your Life. Now this is an interesting song for various reasons. John later said that it was the song that he most regretted writing. He said it was his least favourite Beatles song, and it's a subject matter that, you know, would any sort of huge band these days sing something like that that's got such a sort of a threatening tone to it? Now, this isn't me complaining. I am absolutely not one for judging things from the past by today's standards. You know, things, it was a different set of rules back then pretty much. So I'm not going to be critical of it, but I like the song. But I do love how things you could do back in those days you just wouldn't do now. You wouldn't get away with it so much. But it's not the greatest closer to a Beatles album, certainly, and of course John Lennon would be the first to admit that. But I like it as a sort of a fun throwaway song, but I don't think it's up to the quality of the rest of the album. So that's the album finished anyway. We also need to talk about this amazing cover that's on the front of here. So that photograph, I absolutely love this. Now, the story goes that they'd had this photo session, which I believe was in John's garden, and the photo was taken by Bob Freeman. And when he was showing the Beatles the photographs that he'd taken, he was projecting it onto a white card, and it was sort of sat on a table or something. And at one point, the card just slipped, and because it slipped, it elongated the faces on there. And they just sort of said, "Whoa, that's fantastic. Can we have it like that?" And he went, "Yeah, why not?" So that's why you got that fantastic sort of stretched photograph of the Beatles. And one of the most notable things about this is the fact that their name does not appear on that cover anywhere. They were so famous by this point, you didn't need to put the Beatles on the front cover. You know, it's obvious who it is. And that just shows something about how huge they were by that point. The font, I love the font as well on the writing. And the font was created by a chap called Charles Front, who he described it. I've got a quote actually for you, how he decided to come up with that particular font. I'm just going to read this out to you. He said, "If you tap into a rubber tree, then you get a sort of a globule. So I started thinking of creating a shape that represented that, starting narrow and filling out." So I love the thought that's gone into creating a brand new font for the album and the story behind why that font looks like it is. But I think altogether it makes for one of the all-time great album covers, in my opinion. Me growing up and starting to listen to the Beatles in the 1980s as a child, My mum and dad had a few Beatles albums, not many. They had this, Help, Sgt. Pepper and the Red and Blue compilation albums. But it was from looking at photographs like this that made me sort of think that, wow, who were these people? How can people look as cool as this? And that's why I started to listen to those albums in my mum and dad's collection as opposed to other albums that they might have had. So I've got a fantastic appreciation for this album that goes back to before I sort of became a Beatles fan, really. My overall opinion of this album is that I think it's one of the greatest albums of the 60s, without a doubt. And by that point of view, it's also one of the Beatles' greatest albums. I did a Beatles albums ranking video a few months ago where I'll put a link up to that if you want to see where I rated this. It's up there. Whether it's right up there or not, you'll have to watch and find out if you want to know. But the thing with the Beatles albums is, I think once you start to get into those top few, you know, they're all the greatest albums ever made as far as I'm concerned. This is right up there, especially that mono version. Rubber Soul in mono is just a far superior listening experience than Rubber Soul in stereo. But overall, yeah, I'm saying this is one of the great albums, certainly of the 60s, definitely by the Beatles, quite possibly of all time. Absolutely love it. I would love to hear your comments on this album. Is it one of your favourite Beatles albums? Do you prefer the UK version, or do you prefer the American version? Which did you grow up with? Is there songs that you miss from this from one that you wish were there? Let me know in the comments. I would love to hear from you as always. But in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. As I said, if you'd like to subscribe to my channel, that would be great, because then you'll see any future videos like this that I do. But I will see you again hopefully sometime, and thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.